If you want to help my little channel grow big and strong, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard and another edition of Utterly Pointless Comparisons. Today is a momentous occasion, my friends, for it marks the first time that Utterly Pointless Comparisons will venture into the third dimension. And what better game to start our polygonal journey with than Sega's Virtua Fighter 2? Don't answer that, because no matter what you say, I have already chosen to start it with Virtua Fighter 2, so there we are. Now I'll put some information and some technical specs up on the screen while I talk about the game a little bit. Virtua Fighter 2 was released by Sega in the arcades in 1995, and it ran on their revolutionary for the time Model 2 arcade hardware. Now if you weren't around back then, it's impossible to overstate just what a quantum leap in graphics technology the Model 2 was at the time that it came out. Its earliest games, like Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter 2, they were by far the best looking games in the world at the time of their release. And like Daytona USA, the arcade version of Virtua Fighter 2 runs at a rock-solid 60 frames per second and features fully polygonal backgrounds and characters that were motion captured, I might add. So just a little smidgen of Saturn history before we move on to its port of Virtua Fighter 2. Let's go back in time a bit, shall we, to the point where the Saturn was just launched and it received its port of the original and much simpler Virtua Fighter. That port was very poorly received by the press at the time because it had smaller, slightly cut back characters, and in particular also suffered from flickering polygons. Other launch window games for the Saturn, like Daytona USA, had a host of their own technical issues. Daytona USA, for example, suffered from a very low frame rate, running at only 20 frames per second compared to 60 for the arcade game, had a very near draw distance, and also suffered from pretty horrendous popping. Now, after about 6 months or so, the newer games for the Saturn were finally starting to look a little bit better, but it still seemed like anything close to an accurate port of Virtua Fighter 2 was going to be well beyond the system's capabilities. Then in 1996, Yu Suzuki's AM2, which was the same team that worked on the arcade version of the game, released their port for the Saturn, and it was astounding. I mean, I remember the first time I saw this at a specialty gaming store back when it was brand spanking new, and my jaw practically dropped to the floor. Now, it was by no means a perfect arcade version, no one's going to argue that, and it was definitely cut back in a lot of areas, which we'll discuss, but still, the game looked fantastic, ran at the same solid 60 frames per second frame rate of the arcade game, and it felt just as fast and fluid as the arcade version of the game. So what exactly was cut back in the Saturn version of the game? Well, to start with, the characters used far less polygons than the arcade version of the game, but this was offset a bit by the use of improved texture mapping. Now, the Saturn version completely loses the polygonal backgrounds of the arcade game, and instead has those replaced by several layers of flat parallax scrolling to help simulate the effect. For the most part, this effect actually works pretty well, but there are two stages in particular that really suffer because of this, and I'll point those out as we watch the video in a little bit. The floor textures on the Saturn are also notably lower resolution than the arcade game, but they still look pretty good. One sort of oddity is that the Saturn version of the game actually runs at a higher resolution than the arcade version, considerably higher, but partially because of this, it also has this weird screen bouncing effect because of interlacing, which some people found pretty off-putting. Now some notes on recording methodology. I did cut out most of my round and match losses on this just to save time in the video so you wouldn't have to sit through a bunch of those. I also cut out most of the loading time from the Saturn version of the game between rounds, because I figured who wants to sit through that. But just for reference, the loading time is not bad at all in the Saturn version, it's only like maybe 4 or 5 seconds between rounds in most cases. And I will also provide a little bit of commentary over the video as you're watching it. This one's pretty short, so enjoy. Alright, here we go. Not like my prior comparison videos, I will switch back and forth between the sound on each version of the game, but as it stands, it's almost identical between them. To start out here with Lau's stage, we can definitely see the lack of the polygonal backgrounds in the Saturn version, so we just have the straight up picture in the background, whereas in the arcade one we can see the background actually shifts perspective. Can also see the much lower resolution floor textures and everything here as well. And there you can really get a look at the character of Akira and just how many polygons he's made of in the arcade version versus the Saturn version.
Fight! 1. Ready!
Now for Sarah's stage here, I think this is one where they did a really nice job and it doesn't look too bad compared to the arcade one. Still have the weird effect of the flat backgrounds outside of the ring, so when you get to the edges and people fall out, it looks like they're just kind of floating in front of wallpaper or something. One fun little note is there's a separate background that only shows up if you have Jackie and Sarah, who are siblings fighting against each other. Now, this is one of the stages that suffered the most in the translation from the Model 2 to the Saturn. As you can see in the arcade version, we've got this awesome, huge series of bridges that you go underneath on this raft, and the perspective shifts just as you would expect. But on the Saturn version, they completely removed that. They didn't even try and do anything to make it look like a bridge was going overhead. Now we have Pi's stage, which, again, I think this is one they did a really nice job with. We're also missing a few objects in this one that you can see in the background, such as the smoking pots from the arcade version. Pi as a character, I have to say, probably also is one of the most accurate looking characters in the home port as well. Now we have Leon's stage. And yes, while it is spelled lion, it is pronounced Leon. This one also looks pretty good on the Saturn, even though they lost the entire polygonal background. But something about it, I don't know how to really explain it, it just feels like it's pretty close to the arcade one. It's a shame the Saturn didn't have any kind of texture filtering. Something that we would see to a small degree on the N64 and much more pronounced on the Dreamcast and then in future systems beyond that. I'll also note that Leon is the first fight in the arcade that's actually kind of a challenge. This is one game where the difficulty really scales up as you go through the roster of opponents. And finish him with a nice crotch punch. Alright, here we go, the hardest fight in the game. For those not in the know, this is the easiest fight in the game, because literally all you have to do is keep pressing punch until you win. As far as the quality of the background in the Saturn version, this one looks pretty good because it was pretty plain to begin with in the arcade. We are still missing a few objects and items, but for the most part, it's not that noticeable. And there you are. Kage. This fight is pretty hard in the arcade version when you first get up to him. I have to say, while I was doing this run-through with the arcade one, it had been a long time since I played Virtua Fighter 2, and I kind of forgot what techniques I usually employed to win, and I lost a lot. There are a lot of continues here. In the end, the easiest thing to do is just that. Whip him around so he's behind you, and then just elbow him out of the ring. Since I played the arcade one first and then the Saturn one after for these videos, I had a much easier time going through the Saturn version, even though I would say the difficulty is right on par with the arcade one in general. Here we go, Jackie. This is another fight that is typically really hard if you try and fight it normally. If you just try and whip him around and hit him and ring him out, then it's considerably easier. Another fun little thing to do in this game was position your character so when they do their win animation they fall out of the ring. I didn't do it in this recording, but me and my friends used to do that all the time back when this was new. Now this is the other stage that suffered the most in translation. So for Wolf stage you can see we're missing the fence and we're missing a little windsock looking thing in the background. There are a few other objects like the posts holding the fence up that are obviously missing from the Saturn one as well. There's another fight that you can pretty much win just by punching. So this is how you cheap Virtua Fighter 2 to death. Alright, here we go, the last main fight. Akira's stage looks really good. This may be the best looking round that we have on the Saturn. So obviously it's still lacking all the 3D elements from the arcade one, but it looks really close otherwise. And the music in this stage is by far the best. I love this song. And if you look at the game times in the lower right corner of each screen, you can see how fast I got here in the arcade one versus the Saturn one, which I played a little bit after. This fight is pretty tough if you haven't played this game. Once you get up to Akira, he'll usually make mincemeat out of you the first few times you face him. Now we move on to the final round in the game, Fight vs. Dural. There's a fun little difference between these two versions that I will tell you about after I go back to the live portion of the video. So for Dural stage, if you didn't know, you only get one chance at this. If you lose, you just lose, that's it. You'll also see, unfortunately on the Saturn version, I had some technical difficulties with the recording there, not sure what happened, and spoiler alert, I actually win this fight in the Saturn version, so I didn't want to reload the game and start it over and all that in case I didn't win again. And if you are observant, yes, you will notice that this fight does take place underwater. Your movements are slower and heavier, and it's a lot harder to control, and it's much more difficult to land hits. And Dural as an opponent is also usually pretty damn hard, and it's very tough to avoid her moves. She's got a lot of moves from most of the characters in the game. Oh yeah, take that. So now we have the endings, which are basically the same. You get to watch some footage of you smacking down the enemies you fought in the order you beat them in. And then for the Saturn version, especially after you've actually defeated Dural, you get a nice little picture at the end, which you'll be able to see shortly after the credits finish up here. There is one more thing to talk about before we go to the live portion of the video, and that's how you enter your initials. Here is the initial screen in the arcade version. You can see every letter of the alphabet all together, and you have all your commands like end and backspace and everything there as well. You have to hold the guard button or defend button and then press left or right to switch which letter your character is getting ready to hit, and then you have to knock the letter down in order to register it. The Saturn version didn't have the capability to display enough polygons to show all the letters on the screen, so instead it just shows you one letter, and the letter changes as you hold guard or defense and cycle between them. You can see I finished the Saturn game about 3 times faster than the arcade version. Now we'll have our lovely extra screen coming up on the Saturn. Hooray!
Congratulations!
Oh, hey, you're still there. Well, thanks for sticking around, I guess. And what's that? You want some bonus comparison notes? Well, I guess I can do that. Let's talk about Dural's stage real quick, which is the bonus stage at the end of the game. Did you notice it there? What am I talking about? Well, did you notice that the floor is made of metal? And that in the arcade version of the game, you can actually see reflections of your characters beneath them. But that is completely absent in the Saturn version. Another neat little thing in the Saturn version that's different is it includes an extra mode where it adjusts the enemy AI based on how you play the game, and that's really pretty interesting. And I recommend everyone try it if you haven't. It's definitely different. And that brings us to the end of another video, my friends! Do you have fond memories of either the Saturn or arcade versions, or any other versions for that matter, of Virtua Fighter 2? Feel free to share them in the comments below. With that, I will say thanks for watching, and see me later.